Here's something worth considering. When two nations cease formal dialogue, communication doesn't end. It simply changes form. An anniversary note, a delegation at a memorial service, a naval vessel appearing unexpectedly in contested waters. These aren't random occurrences, and their stated purposes rarely match their actual intent. Today I want to examine a series of developments that individually appear routine, but collectively reveal something much more pointed about the current situation. I'll cover 4 areas: Iran, Belarus, the Baltic region, and the larger question of who's actually making security decisions in Europe at this moment. Bear with me, because the links between events matter far more than any isolated story. Begin in Tehran. The highest-ranking Russian official to visit since relations were formalized after the conflict traveled there this week, and his mission extended beyond attending a funeral. His portfolio includes 2 relevant roles, one symbolic, one substantive. Symbolically, he attended the burial of a figure killed in an aerial attack. That presence alone conveys a message. Moscow isn't distancing itself from Tehran, it's standing beside the casket. Substantively, he oversees Russia's defense production apparatus. And it's worth noting, I choose that phrase deliberately, since coincidence gets misused constantly in analysis, that just before his arrival, sources connected to Russian security circles began circulating fairly specific details about advanced combat aircraft production intended for Iran. Not vague commitments, actual numbers, completed airframes, delivery schedules, total procurement figures. Similar stories have surfaced repeatedly over the years and consistently amounted to nothing. So appropriate skepticism is warranted, but observe the timing. The information emerges precisely as the visit is scheduled, neither earlier nor later. That's not typical behavior for authentic intelligence leaks. That's how governments signal intentions without formal documentation. There's another dimension worth considering. Iran has new leadership at the highest level, and virtually nothing has been verified about his health, whereabouts, or, depending on which accounts you find credible, whether the official narrative surrounding him reflects reality. A senior Russian official arriving during this uncertainty, potentially the first foreign representative of genuine standing to gain access, carries real weight. It demonstrates that 2 governments still view each other as essential. At precisely the moment many Western observers assumed Iran had been sufficiently marginalized that such visits wouldn't occur or wouldn't signify much. They signify plenty. Watch what develops in subsequent weeks, not what's announced immediately. Turn now to Belarus, where the underlying framework becomes clearer. On the anniversary commemorating Belarusian independence, the letter arriving from Moscow appeared superficially ceremonial. Standard language about common heritage, about Minsk's liberation in the Second World War, about brotherhood. Diplomatic correspondence of this type is usually forgettable. This one wasn't. Look beyond the formalities, and there's particular phrasing. Cooperation against external threats and challenges. That language is operational. Which threats? 2, neither subtle. First, Ukraine has been applying direct pressure on Belarus, insisting it dismantle relay systems allegedly facilitating drone coordination against Ukrainian targets, demanding cessation of petroleum product exports to Russia, and occasionally appearing to demand Belarus sever economic relations with Moscow entirely. That's an extraordinary demand to make of any sovereign state. Minsk has responded by doing precisely the opposite, publicly informing a Ukrainian delegation that such pressure is unacceptable, then almost immediately meeting Russian counterparts to reaffirm alignment. Second, and this receives insufficient coverage, there was an extended summit between the 2 leaders reportedly lasting 2 complete days at a location Russia previously claimed was targeted in a drone assassination attempt. 2 days isn't a photo session. 2 days represents substantive negotiation, almost certainly involving military planning personnel from both sides. So when the anniversary letter references fruitful cooperation and coordinating efforts against external threats, it isn't sentimentality. It's a public acknowledgement following private arrangements. This requires care, because specifics and sourcing matter. According to information from sources outside Russia, unaffiliated with the Russian state, who have proven reliable on similar details previously, approximately 45,000 Russian troops are currently dispersed throughout Belarusian territory, not concentrated in a single formation, distributed, integrated into training operations, embedded in infrastructure reinforcement. More notable, in my assessment, is what's occurred with Belarus's own military. For years, conventional wisdom held that Belarus's armed forces were obsolete. Soviet legacy equipment, minimal readiness, more symbolic than substantive. That assumption apparently no longer applies. The active force remains relatively modest, perhaps 20,000 ground personnel, but it's reportedly been re-equipped to something approximating current Russian standards. And Belarus maintains mobilization infrastructure capable of expanding those numbers considerably on short notice. There's also a reference template being discussed for activation scenarios, the Kursk incursion from August 2024. That episode apparently serves in planning contexts as the model for how Russia and Belarus would respond to any comparable thrust toward Minsk. I won't elaborate further on what such contingency planning might entail. That crosses from analysis into operational detail, and public speculation seems irresponsible. The essential point is straightforward. Belarus has quietly transitioned from symbolic partner to forward operational zone. That represents a qualitative shift, not merely quantitative. Now, at virtually the same moment, a report appeared in European media, originating with a Polish outlet under German ownership, then amplified through a well-known hawkish tabloid and a British broadsheet, undergoing similar ownership transitions, claiming the Polish president received private warning from American intelligence that Russia is preparing some form of provocation against Poland. The alleged provocation's nature remains vague. Drones, missiles, potentially something more, with possibilities left deliberately open to ground elements. Let me explain why I think this warrants substantial skepticism. Not because provocations are implausible, but because of how this narrative is constructed. First, sourcing. It derives from unnamed individuals allegedly close to the Polish president, not American sources, which would be the logical origin if American intelligence genuinely reached this assessment. When warnings of this magnitude are authentic, they typically surface first from the country whose intelligence services produce them. Here, it surfaced in outlets known for particular editorial positions regarding Russia. Second, timing and substance. Just days prior, the Russian president made a public statement to his party Congress. A statement frankly unambiguous in its logic. NATO states haven't yet launched missiles or drones from their own territory against Russia, he noted, because they understand doing so would provoke Russian response against launch sites. That's a conditional, reactive threat. It's fundamentally different from, we're planning to strike Poland, yet it's remarkably easy to reframe a conditional warning through translation and repetition as an offensive plan. I believe that's what occurred here. Third, and this reflects a broader pattern worth recognizing, stories with this structure tend to emerge when European governments want to draw the United States into firmer, more explicit commitment to Article 5. If you want Washington re-anchored to European defense, a credible-sounding leak about imminent Russian testing of NATO's resolve serves as an effective instrument. I'm not asserting that's definitively what happened. I'm noting the incentive structure aligns too precisely to dismiss. Concurrently, a respected British Defense Institute published analysis arguing that multiple Russian drone incursions over NATO territory, some allegedly coordinated from vessels in the so-called Shadow Fleet, have systematically probed European air defense gaps. The claim about gaps themselves isn't disputed. It's been publicly acknowledged for over a year that European air defense coverage has significant holes. What's less established is attribution of every incident. At least one widely referenced case, drones over a major airport, was reportedly contradicted by local reporting as unconfirmed. If accurate, that should encourage greater caution, not less, about accepting every incursion claim uncritically. Then there's the element harder to dismiss, a reported maritime confrontation. A vessel from a NATO member's Coast Guard approached a Russian-linked tanker in the Baltic. A Russian naval vessel, reportedly a missile corvette, moved to intercept, issued warning, and the Coast Guard vessel withdrew. This isn't unprecedented. Months earlier, a similar standoff involved an Estonian vessel and a commercial ship trading with Russia, resolved when Russian aircraft scrambled and the Estonian side backed down. I want to establish the connection rather than treating this as isolated maritime incident. Connect the letter to Minsk, the troop concentration in Belarus, the reported summit and cooperation agreement, the drone incursion narrative, and now an actual naval confrontation. The picture emerges of two sides probing boundaries of mutual tolerance in a region where miscalculation carries disproportionate consequences. Kaliningrad borders Poland, Belarus borders Poland too, and Ukraine. Any serious clash in this theater doesn't remain confined to the vessels or aircraft directly involved. It draws in everything surrounding it rapidly. My own judgment, such as it is, attempting to challenge Russian resolve in the Baltic would be reckless. Whatever symbolic value NATO's expansion around that coastline represents, underlying military geography still favors Russia substantially. A major naval installation, considerable air capability, missile coverage from multiple vectors. I don't state this to endorse anyone's aggression. I state it because I believe numerous voices in European policy circles are underestimating what actual confrontation there would entail and overestimating what deterrence currently exists to prevent one. There's a quieter transformation occurring simultaneously concerning the European Union itself, not NATO. For months, Russian officials across various portfolios have converged on identical reasoning, that the EU is no longer merely an economic bloc, but has become a military-political entity in its own right, making Ukraine's accession equally unacceptable to Moscow as NATO membership. Until recently, the Russian president himself avoided stating this explicitly. that restraint appears to be ending. His spokesman has now stated plainly that the EU is transforming into a military political economic bloc, investing heavily in militarizing member economies, and Russia is incorporating this transformation into its calculations. When a president's spokesman employs language this specific, it's reasonable to assume it reflects presidential thinking, not independent opinion. The practical consequence: any diplomatic settlement, assuming Ukraine can simply pivot toward EU membership as compensation for remaining outside NATO, will likely encounter this redefinition directly. Moscow appears to be closing that option before anyone attempts it. Now, to the figure that deserves more scrutiny than it's receiving: a reported concentration of approximately 170,000 Russian troops in Bryansk region, bordering Ukraine's Chernihiv region northward. Ukraine's senior military commander stated publicly that orders exist to eventually take Kiev, connecting those orders to possible advance from Bryansk into Chernihiv. I'd urge restraint before assuming that's the immediate objective. Sourcing close to this buildup suggests the more probable near-term purpose is consolidation, extending Russian control throughout the northeast, expanding what's sometimes termed the buffer zone, and further straining Ukrainian forces already under severe pressure elsewhere along contact lines. But set interpretation aside momentarily and simply consider the number. 170,000 troops with substantial proportion of heavy self-propelled artillery, capable of reaching Chernihiv city from just across the border, represents a force considerably larger than what Russia committed to the entire Kiev offensive during the war's opening weeks. Whatever the intended employment, a force of that magnitude doesn't remain stationary indefinitely. Eventually it advances, and when it does, however limited the declared objective, the psychological impact in Kyiv and throughout European capitals will be severe, arguably more severe than anything since the war's initial phase. On contact lines themselves, the pattern from recent weeks has been acceleration, not deceleration. Reports, again, treat specific figures skeptically, suggest advance pace increased substantially compared with the preceding month. Positions around Lyman and Kostiantynivka continue the methodical clearing operations typically following Russian capture of built-up areas. Further south, forces have reportedly advanced close enough to key fortified Ukrainian positions east of Sloviansk and Kramatorsk that footage from ground units, not drone reconnaissance but soldiers physically present, shows the Sloviansk thermal plant clearly visible on the horizon. That's a proximity indicator, not a capture, but it reveals how near fighting has approached what's widely considered among the more defensible anchor points in the region. There's disagreement over whether the settlement of Mykolaiivka, situated on lower ground than elevated terrain, Russian forces reportedly now control, will be vigorously defended or fall quickly once seriously contested. I lack visibility into which assessment is accurate and would treat confident predictions either direction skeptically. In the air, the exchange pattern continues largely unchanged. A substantial combined drone and missile strike on Kiev, followed by Ukrainian retaliatory effort. Several hundred drones launched at Russian territory, majority intercepted, limited damage from those penetrating defenses, alongside separate and reportedly more damaging strikes against targets in Crimea. I'd resist the increasingly common framing that this renders Crimea a strategic liability for Russia. Damage from drone strikes is real, but hasn't demonstrably degraded actual military capability there. By identical logic applied to make that argument about Crimea, the considerably heavier strikes on Kyiv would render Kyiv itself an unsustainable liability for Ukraine, and almost nobody is prepared to follow that logic to conclusion. Be cautious of selectively applied arguments. Beneath all this lies a factor explaining more current European anxiety than most commentary acknowledges: growing perception that the United States is quietly disengaging from its historic role as Europe's security guarantor. The American president has continued publicly questioning fairness of an arrangement where the U.S. commits unconditionally to defending European NATO members who, in his framing, were conspicuously absent when Washington required support during its recent confrontation with Iran. This aligns with his long-standing position that European allies have underinvested in their own defense, while assuming American support is automatic. My reading is this represents at least substantially a pressure tactic intended to push Europe toward procuring more of its own weapons, largely from American suppliers, rather than genuine intent to abandon the alliance entirely. But I believe many observers underestimate how destabilizing this rhetoric actually is to European planners. And here's why. Consider the position European governments have created for themselves. They've spent years antagonizing Russia diplomatically. They've supported an open-ended conflict in Ukraine that, however vigorously denied publicly, most serious planners privately understand isn't progressing favorably. Their own defense industrial capacity is, by most candid internal assessments, incapable of producing weapons at scales a serious confrontation with Russia would require. Their standing militaries are, in relative terms, not currently positioned to prevail in conventional warfare against a larger and more combat-experienced Russian force. And they did all this while assuming that if circumstances ever became critical, the United States would intervene. Now, the President of that United States is publicly questioning whether that assumption remains valid. Simultaneously, a recent US-Iran confrontation has, in many outside observers' eyes, demonstrated limits of American power more clearly than anticipated. Combine those elements, and you approach something resembling genuine fear in European capitals. And fear historically doesn't yield careful policy. It yields overreaction, sometimes toward accommodation, but equally often toward escalation, based on logic that forcing confrontation now, while some American support still exists, is preferable to waiting until it doesn't. None of this constitutes an argument for militarization or provoking wider conflict. If anything, it's precisely the reverse. The logical response to this level of mutual fear should be serious diplomatic engagement from both sides. But diplomacy requires willingness to negotiate. And presently, I don't observe European governments, as distinct from Ukrainians and Americans who are at least nominally maintaining contact with Moscow, showing any appetite for that whatsoever. One additional thread, since it tends to vanish beneath military headlines, the legal battle over frozen Russian central bank assets is intensifying. A Moscow arbitration court ruled in Russia's favor in proceedings brought against the European settlement institution holding those frozen funds. In response, that institution reportedly initiated counter-litigation in Belgian courts, apparently attempting to offset whatever judgment Moscow might attempt enforcing. I'll acknowledge limits of my understanding here. I haven't reviewed actual pleadings from either side, and legal proceedings like this frequently hinge on details absent from public reporting. But the broader signal is unmistakable. European institutions are treating Russian legal challenge seriously enough to mount defense across multiple jurisdictions simultaneously. That's not behavior from an institution, confident the matter will simply evaporate. Expect this battle to proceed parallel to military and diplomatic tracks indefinitely, and expect it to become its own friction source between Moscow and Brussels. So let's synthesize the threads. A senior Russian official cementing relations with Iran at Tehran's moment of maximum vulnerability. A ceremonial letter to Minsk that's actually public acknowledgement of private military arrangements. A Belarusian military quietly transformed from symbolic to substantial. A Western media narrative about imminent Russian provocation that upon examination resembles more an attempt to re-anchor American commitment than genuine intelligence warning. An actual naval confrontation in the Baltic, demonstrating both sides' willingness to test boundaries at sea. 170,000 troops positioned at a border they haven't yet crossed. And underlying everything, growing and largely justified anxiety in European capitals that the American security guarantee their entire strategy depends upon may not be as reliable as assumed. I don't believe any of this makes wider conflict inevitable, but I think it clarifies that the current trajectory, more deployments, more leaks, more naval standoffs, and essentially zero genuine diplomatic contact, isn't a stable equilibrium. It's the type of situation that tends to resolve through one of two paths. Through actual negotiation nobody currently seems willing to initiate, or through an incident that forces one. I'd strongly prefer the former. I'm not confident that's the direction we're heading. That's where I'll conclude for now.